Well, welcome back. And we're just about to get into chapter 5, Esther. Esther approaches the king. Verse 1, Now it came to pass on the third day, Esther put on her royal clothing and stood in the inner court of the king's house, next to the king's house. The king sat on the royal throne in the royal house, next to the entrance of the house. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing there in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and he held out the scepter and Esther, and so Esther approached him and touched the top of the scepter. So first off, it mentions that on the third day, 3 is a number that means completeness. They could do no more through prayer. It was now time for Esther to go take action. All houses had a courtyard back then where people could meet. This is one of the places where the men and women could gather together. Now, of course, the palace would have several courtyards. This is where Esther stood, wearing her royal garb, directly across from where the king would sit. The king would sit on his throne while take care of royal business. Boy, I said that with a straight face and didn't lose it. The king takes notice of Esther, and he held out the golden scepter to Esther. Then the king asks, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given unto you, even up to half of my kingdom. All these kings, Joseph, Pharaoh offered him up to half the kingdom. And, you go through the whole Hebrew scriptures, and the kings are always offering up to half of the kingdom. Okay, verse 4. Esther said, It seems good to the king. Let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him. Esther did not jump right into the thing about killing her people. She was smart enough to realize that this had to be handled with a bit more subtlety. Her plan included Haman in some way. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly so that it may be done as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet for Esther that Esther had prepared. Verse 6. The king said to Esther at the banquet of wine, What is your petition? It will be granted up to you. What is your request? Even up to half of my kingdom, and it will be performed. After the feast, the men would drink. And it was always referred to as the banquet of wine, because the guys would sit around drinking wine. Verse 7, Then Esther said, My petition and request is this, If thou hast found favor in thy eyes of the king, and it please the king to grant me a petition and do what I request, let the king and Haman come to a banquet that I will prepare for them tomorrow. I will do this for the king I will do as the king has asked. The plot thickens. This is more proof that the Bible shows how people act and react in a really tough situation. This is real life drama. I mean, this is a young girl. She's probably 17, 18 years, 19 years old, someplace around there. And she's being asked to save a nation. Think about that. I know at 19 I wouldn't have done very well at that. Verse 9, Then Haman went out that day joyful with a merry heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, he didn't stand up or move for him. He was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home and sent for and brought together his friends, Xerxes, his wife. Then Haman recounted the glory of the riches of the multitude of his children and all the things which the king had promoted him and how he advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come in with the king to the banquet." Verse 12, Haman said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come to the king's banquet that she had prepared. And also I am invited to her together with the king again. Yet all this thing is worth nothing so long as Mordecai the Jew is sitting in the gate." So Haman is impressed with himself because he was the only person other than the king who was invited to this feast put on by the queen. Then Xerxes, his wife, and all of his friends said unto him, "Let a stake 75 feet high be set up in the morning. Speak to the king about hanging Mordecai upon it, and go merrily into the king to the banquet." This was good in the eyes of Haman, so he set the stake up. Now, the stake would not be 75 feet high. There would be no way for them to put him on top of the stake. They would put up a platform, and the stake would be on the top and easy to see from the ground. You can see this in the commentary. You can see that the Hebrew word is literally tree or wood. It would be a wooden stake itself, could not have been 75 feet. They had no way to get Mordecai's body, and some of the wall or platform and base was on top of a platform. And the Assyrians did this. They did not hang people from the gallows by the neck like Westerners are used to. Instead, their custom, documented as far back as the Code of Hammurabi, about the time of Abraham, was to impale people on a stake. Usually the stake went through the front of their body and under the rib cage, and this practice can be seen in Assyria bas relief rock cut and made celebrating the Assyrian victory over the biblical city of Lachish. The victim was hung on the stake, but not hung by a rope. He was hung or suspended on the stake. Many versions say impaled instead of hung for clarity. Haman was the enemy of the Jews again. He represented a prophetic picture of the devil himself. Haman schemed to kill Mordecai, the figurative head of the Jews, by hanging him on a stake, and thus rid God's people, the earth of God's people. It's interesting that he wants to hang him on a stake. Does that make Mordecai a Christ-type person? You know, these are the things that Jesus Christ would see. He would see this stuff, and this is his instruction book. Okay, but God worked to turn the schemes upside down. Haman was impaled on his own stake instead of killing the Messiah and God's people. Jesus' death came across, ensured of the death of the devil and the salvation of God's people. Okay, so let's go back to Esther chapter 6. Mordecai honored by the king. On that night, what night? I don't know. Could have been Tuesday. The king could not sleep. He commanded to bring the scroll of the records of the events of the day, and they were read to the king. It was found that Mordecai had told the king, about these two guys who were going to, eunuchs who were going to kill the king. And the king said, "What honor and great thing has been done to Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Okay, you can look this up in the commentary, but Mike, you don't have to go there because it's all written right here. could not sleep is idiomatic. The literal Hebrew reads, the king's sleep fled away. So even the king knew he had to do something for Mordecai. It was an oversight, nothing malicious in my opinion. It was just an oversight. Verse 4, and the king said, who is in the court? Now Naaman had just come into the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the stake that he had set up for him. And the king's servant said, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, have him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked, what should be done for the man who delights and honors the king? Now Haman said in his heart, who would the king delight to honor more than me? Haman said to the king, for this man the king delights to honor, let him bring royal clothing that the king himself has put on, and a horse that the king rides on, which has a royal crown placed upon its head, and let the clothing and the horse be delivered into the hand of the one of the king's most noble officers, that they may array the man whom the king delights to honor with all, and have him ride on the horseback throughout the city square, proclaiming before all, this is what this is done for the man who the king delights to honor. In verse 6, it says, in his heart. This is the same word as the word thought. The arrogance of Haman is only surpassed by his own arrogance. To think that because the king wishes to reward someone, it must be himself, shows just how arrogant he truly was. Boy, he was laying it on thick when he assumed it was for himself. Verse 10. The king said unto Haman, hurry and take the clothing and the horses you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew who sits in the gate. Do not leave anything out that you have spoken. Then Haman took the clothing and the horse and clothed Mordecai and had him ride through the city square, crying out before him, this is what is done for the man who delights and honors the king. Talk about having egg on your face. He is now honoring the man he wants to destroy. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and having his head covered. Then Haman recounted to Xerxes his wife and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. And his wise men and Xerxes his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hurried to bring Haman to the banquet that Queen Esther had prepared. Of Jewish descent means literally of the seed or offspring of the Jew. So our next session, we'll get into the second banquet that Esther throws for the king and Haman and see what happens there. In the meantime, Father, thank you for your word and just how alive it is, and how if people really sat down and read it, they would be reading these intensely great accounts of men and women who stood for you and how things have happened. Whether it's Esther or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Abraham, or David, or any of the great men of God, great men and women of God, who stood and believed for your word to come to pass in their lives as they awaited the coming of the Lord. And for us as we await the return of the Lord. So, on that note, I guess we'll see you all next week.